Colonel James Whitfield's body was found 500 meters below Camp 3 on Cho Oyu. His face was unrecognizable. His down suit was shredded. His left hand was still gripping a tent stake that had been ripped clean from the ice. He'd been dead for approximately 9 hours. His climbing partner, Marcus Henley, was alive. Marcus was found 200 meters higher, wedged behind a rock outcrop, hypothermic but breathing. Their tents had been 6 meters apart. 6 meters. That was the difference between a dead man and a living one. But here's what makes this story different from every other climber ignored a warning tragedy you've ever heard. Whitfield didn't ignore the warning because he was reckless. He didn't ignore it because he was stupid. He didn't ignore it because he was some ego-drunk influencer chasing content. Colonel James Whitfield was a retired United States Army officer who had spent 28 years making life-and-death risk assessments in combat zones across 3 continents. He'd led convoys through IED-laden roads in Afghanistan. He'd coordinated evacuations under mortar fire in Iraq. He'd kept hundreds of soldiers alive through decisions made in seconds with incomplete information. Risk assessment wasn't just something Whitfield did. It was who he was. When expedition leader Lakpa Dendi warned him about an incoming jet stream wind event above Camp 3, Whitfield didn't dismiss it out of hand. He asked questions. Specific questions. He asked about wind speed projections. He asked about the forecast window. He asked about historical patterns for that week in May. He ran his own calculations based on 28 years of tactical weather analysis. And his calculations were correct. Every single number Whitfield computed was accurate. Wind speeds, timing, probability, all correct. But he made one assumption that was catastrophically wrong. He assumed that a tent rated for 100 miles per hour winds, properly anchored into ice, would hold against sustained 80 miles per hour gusts at 200 meters. On flat ground it would have. On a military base it would have. On any of the 4 peaks Whitfield had previously summited, it probably would have. But Cho Oyu at 200 meters isn't flat ground. The ice at that altitude isn't the same ice you find at 5,000 meters. It's brittle. It's layered. It fractures differently. And tent stakes driven into that ice behave differently than tent stakes driven into compact snow or frozen soil. Whitfield knew wind. He knew tents. He knew risk calculation. But he didn't know Cho Oyu ice. Lakpa Dendi did. Lakpa had spent 14 seasons on that mountain. He'd placed over 3,000 tent anchors above 7,000 meters across his career. He knew exactly how Cho Oyu ice behaves under lateral stress in sustained wind. And he told Whitfield clearly and directly that the anchoring surface above Camp 3 would not hold in jet stream conditions. Whitfield's response became the most quoted sentence in the investigation that followed. "Shut up. I've survived worse than wind." Those 7 words ended a 4-minute conversation. They ended Lakpa Dendi's guiding career. And within 14 hours, they ended Colonel James Whitfield's life. Now everyone who hears this story stops right there. Military arrogance, ignored local expertise, predictable death, case closed. But that's not the full story. It's not even close to the full story. Because if you stop there, you miss the most disturbing detail of this entire tragedy. Marcus Henley heard the same warning. Marcus Henley was standing right next to Whitfield during that conversation. Marcus watched Whitfield tell Lakpa to shut up. Marcus had even less climbing experience than Whitfield. Marcus had summited exactly 2 peaks in his life, both below 7,000 meters. By every measure, Marcus should have been the one who died that night. He didn't. Marcus survived because of where he pitched his tent. 6 meters to the left of Whitfield, behind a rock outcrop that was barely visible above the snow line. When the wind hit, Marcus's tent was partially shielded. His anchors held not because they were better, but because the wind load on his tent was roughly 40% lower than the wind load on Whitfield's fully exposed position. Whitfield chose the exposed position deliberately. He wanted the view. He told Marcus the outcrop would create wind turbulence that would make sleep uncomfortable. He was right about the turbulence. He was wrong about what mattered more: comfort or survival. If you want to subscribe, do it now. Because this story is about to get much darker than a man who picked the wrong campsite. There's another layer to this that nobody reported at the time. Lakpa Dendi didn't just warn Whitfield once. He warned him 3 times over the course of that day. The shut up conversation was the third warning. The first 2 were calm, professional, detailed. Lakpa presented weather data. He showed Whitfield forecasts on his satellite phone. He pointed to cloud formations on the horizon that experienced Himalayan climbers recognize as jet stream indicators. Whitfield listened to the first 2 warnings carefully. He took notes. He asked intelligent questions. He cross-referenced Lakpa's data with his own weather assessment training from the Army, and each time he reached the same conclusion: the risk was manageable with proper preparation. By the third warning, Whitfield was frustrated. He felt Lakpa was being overly cautious. He felt Lakpa was treating him like a tourist, not a combat veteran. He felt his expertise was being dismissed. The irony is devastating. Whitfield told Lakpa to shut up because he felt disrespected. But Lakpa was the one whose expertise was actually being disrespected. 2 professionals. 2 different kinds of expertise. One of them was right about Cho Oyu, one of them was dead wrong. And then there's what Lakpa did after Whitfield told him to shut up. This is where the story breaks your heart. Lakpa didn't argue. He didn't push back. He didn't threaten to refuse to guide. He simply nodded, walked to his own tent, and wrote a satellite message to his wife in Kathmandu. That message read, "Client won't listen. I think someone will die tonight. I don't know what to do." Lakpa Dendi had been guiding for 14 years. He'd led over 60 expeditions above 7,000 meters. He'd warned countless climbers about countless dangers. Most listened. Some didn't. But he'd never before sent a message like that to his wife. He'd never used the word die in a forecast. He knew. He absolutely knew what was coming. And he couldn't stop it. The expedition company, Summit Horizon Expeditions, had a policy. Guides could recommend, they could warn, they could strongly advise, but they could not physically prevent a paying client from climbing. Whitfield had paid $14,000 for this expedition. He'd signed liability waivers. He was a competent adult making an informed decision. Lakpa's hands were tied by company policy, by contract, by the fundamental structure of commercial climbing. So Lakpa did the only thing he could. He stayed at Camp 2. He refused to climb higher with Whitfield. He told Marcus that he was welcome to stay at Camp 2 as well. Marcus considered it. For about 30 seconds, Marcus considered staying with Lakpa. Then he looked at Whitfield heading up toward Camp 3, and he followed. That 30-second decision, Marcus's choice to follow Whitfield instead of staying with Lakpa, would haunt Marcus Henley for the rest of his life. Not because he nearly died, because he survived. And surviving meant carrying the memory of what he heard that night when the wind came. To understand why Whitfield made every choice he made, why his military mind worked against him on Cho Oyu, and why Marcus Henley followed a man into a death trap, despite knowing better, you need to understand who these men were before they ever saw a mountain. Because the colonel who arrived at base camp in April 2021 had been building toward this moment for 5 years. And the seed of his death wasn't planted on Cho Oyu. It was planted in a military hospital, in Walter Reed, in a conversation with a doctor who told him he'd never be the man he was before. What Whitfield was trying to prove on that mountain, and who he was trying to prove it to, changes everything about this story. Blank, _ blank. Chapter 2. The Colonel, the Accountant, and the Man Who Knew the Mountain, James Edward Whitfield, was born in 1968 in Fort Bragg, North Carolina. His father was Army. His grandfather was Army. His great-grandfather was Army. The Whitfields didn't choose the military chose them before they were born. James commissioned as a second lieutenant in 1990, 2 months before Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait. By the time he was 24, he'd already seen combat. Over the next 28 years, Whitfield built a career that most soldiers only read about. 2 tours in Iraq, 3 in Afghanistan, multiple deployments to classified locations he'd never discussed with his family. He commanded a battalion of 600 soldiers. He earned a Bronze Star. He earned a Purple Heart after shrapnel from an IED hit his left shoulder in Kandahar province in 2011. The shoulder healed. Mostly. The nerve damage never fully resolved. His left arm was about 80% of what it had been. For most people, that would be a minor inconvenience. For Whitfield, it was the beginning of the end. In 2016, a medical review board at Walter Reed National Military Medical Center evaluated Whitfield's shoulder. The nerve damage had plateaued. It wasn't getting worse, but it wasn't getting better. The board recommended continued active duty with limitations. No overhead lifting beyond 40 pounds with the left arm. Modified physical fitness standards. Desk-eligible positions. Whitfield heard one word in that evaluation. Limitations. The doctor, a colonel himself, sat Whitfield down and said something that Whitfield would repeat to 3 different people over the next 5 years. The exact words varied slightly each time, but the core message was always the same. James, you need to accept that your body has changed. You're not the soldier you were at 30. That's not failure. That's reality. Whitfield retired from the Army in 2018 at the age of 50. Full pension. Full honors. A career that any military family would celebrate for generations. His wife, Catherine, was relieved. Their 2 children, Thomas, 19, and Sophie, 16, were ready to have their father home. The Whitfield family was supposed to start a new chapter, a quieter one, a safer one. It lasted about 4 months. Catherine noticed the changes first. James wasn't sleeping. He wasn't eating properly. He was in the gym at 4:30 every morning, pushing his shoulder past its limits, grimacing through pain he refused to acknowledge. He started reading mountaineering books. Stacks of them. John Krakauer, Ed Viesturs, Reinhold Messner. He watched climbing documentaries every night. Catherine thought it was a phase. A retired military officer finding a new hobby. Harmless. Then he booked his first expedition. Kilimanjaro. The tallest mountain in Africa, but technically a trekking peak. No technical climbing required. Whitfield summited in 4 days. He called Catherine from Uhuru Peak and said, "I found it. I found what replaces the army." Catherine felt her stomach drop. She knew her husband. She knew that voice. It was the same voice he used when he told her he was deploying for the 3rd time. Calm. Certain. Absolutely non-negotiable. Within 18 months, Whitfield summited 3 more peaks. Elbrus in Russia. Aconcagua in Argentina. Island Peak in Nepal. Each one higher than the last. Each one more technical. Each one requiring more from his damaged shoulder. He never complained about the pain. He never acknowledged the limitation. He trained around it. He adapted. He compensated. He proved, climb after climb, that the Walter Reed doctor was wrong. Or at least, that's what he told himself. If you're watching this, and you know a veteran, if you know someone who defined themselves by their service and then lost that identity, you understand exactly what was driving James Whitfield up these mountains. It wasn't adventure. It wasn't ego exactly. It was purpose. The military gave Whitfield a framework for understanding who he was. Without it, he was unmoored. The mountains gave him something to be again, something to conquer, something to survive. Cho Oyu was supposed to be the crown jewel. At 188 meters, it's the 6th highest mountain on Earth. It's considered the easiest of the 8,000-meter peaks. For Whitfield, it was the gateway to Everest. Summit Cho Oyu. Prove he could operate above 8,000 meters, then apply for an Everest permit the following year. That was the plan. That was the 5-year trajectory he built. Since sitting in that Walter Reed examination room hearing a doctor tell him he was diminished, Whitfield arrived at Cho Oyu Base Camp on April 15, 2021. He was 53 years old. His shoulder still ached in cold weather. He'd compensated for it so effectively that most people couldn't tell. But Lakba Dendi noticed. On day 2 at base camp, Lakba watched Whitfield struggle to lift a 20-kilogram equipment bag with his left arm. Whitfield caught Lakba watching. He switched to his right arm and lifted the bag smoothly. Neither man said a word about it, but Lakba made a note in his expedition log that night. Client W has left shoulder weakness. Monitor above Camp 2. Now let's talk about Marcus Henley. Because Marcus is the reason this story isn't a simple cautionary tale. Marcus Henley was 41 years old. He was an accountant from Bristol, England. He worked for a mid-sized accounting firm. He had a wife named Sarah and a 7-year-old son named Oliver. He was, by every possible measure, an ordinary man. Marcus had taken up climbing 3 years earlier after a corporate team-building weekend in Snowdonia, Wales. Something clicked. He loved the physicality. He loved the simplicity. He loved that on a mountain, the only metrics that mattered were altitude and survival. Not quarterly reports, not client acquisition targets, not office politics. He'd summited Mont Blanc and Mera Peak. That was his entire high-altitude resume. 2 peaks, neither above 7,000 meters. When he signed up for the Cho Oyu expedition with Summit Horizon Expeditions, the company flagged his limited experience. They recommended additional training. Marcus completed a 3-week mountaineering course in Chamonix before departing. Marcus wasn't trying to prove anything. He wasn't running from anything. He wasn't filling a void left by military service or chasing purpose. He just loved climbing. He'd saved for 2 years to afford the $14,000 expedition fee. Sarah had supported him, reluctantly. Oliver had drawn him a picture of a mountain with a flag on top. Marcus kept it in his pack. It was still there when they pulled him off the mountain. Marcus and Whitfield met at base camp on April 16th. They were assigned to the same climbing team, a group of 5 clients, 2 Sherpa guides, and Lakpa Dendi as expedition leader. The other 3 clients would turn back at various points during the expedition. By the time Whitfield and Marcus reached Camp 2 on May 17th, it was just the 2 of them, Lakpa, and 1 support Sherpa named Dorje Tamang. Whitfield liked Marcus immediately. Marcus was quiet, respectful, and didn't pretend to know more than he did. He asked good questions. He deferred to Lakpa's expertise on technical decisions. He was, in Whitfield's estimation, a good soldier, the highest compliment the colonel knew how to give. Marcus, for his part, was in awe of Whitfield. Here was a decorated military officer, a Bronze Star recipient, a man who'd led hundreds of soldiers in combat. Marcus had never met anyone like him. When Whitfield spoke about risk assessment, Marcus listened like a student. When Whitfield made a decision, Marcus followed it. This dynamic, the colonel leading, the accountant following, would become the central tragedy of what happened above Camp 3. Now, Lakpa Dendi. Lakpa was 38 years old. He was born in Pangboche, a village in the Khumbu region of Nepal at 3,985 meters. He grew up at an altitude higher than most European ski resorts. His father was a porter. His uncle was one of the first Sherpas to work on commercial Cho Oyu expeditions in the 1990s. Lakpa started carrying loads at 16. By 20, he was a certified climbing Sherpa. By 24, he was leading expeditions. He'd summited Cho Oyu 9 times, Everest 4 times, Manaslu 3 times. He had more time above 7,000 meters than most Western climbers accumulate in a lifetime. But Lakpa wasn't just experienced. He was careful. Other Sherpas described him as the one who says no. In an industry where Sherpas are financially pressured to keep clients happy, to say yes, to push for summits even when conditions are dangerous, Lakpa had built a reputation for turning clients around. He'd canceled summit pushes 6 times in his career when he judged conditions too dangerous. 3 of those times, other teams summited successfully on the same day. Lakpa took the criticism. He took the negative reviews. He'd rather have an angry client than a dead one. His wife, Dawa Yangzom, said something in an interview after the disaster that captures Lakpa perfectly. Lakpa always said the mountain gives you many chances to go up. It only gives you 1 chance to come down alive. He made sure his people always had that chance. Until May 2021. Until Colonel James Whitfield told him to shut up. Lakpa arrived at base camp before any clients. He spent 8 days studying conditions, checking route reports from other expeditions, talking to weather forecasters in Kathmandu and Innsbruck. By the time his clients arrived, Lakpa had a detailed risk profile for every section of the route above Camp 1. What Lakpa saw developing in mid-May worried him. The jet stream. That river of high-altitude wind that typically sits above 9,000 meters was dropping. Forecast models from both the Kathmandu Meteorological Office and a private European forecasting service showed the jet stream descending to approximately 7,500 meters between May 19th and May 21st. That meant sustained winds of 70 to 100 miles per hour at Camp 3's elevation of 7,200 meters. Most climbing teams on Cho Oyu that season planned their summit pushes for before May 19th or after May 22nd. Lakpa planned the same. The original summit push for Whitfield's team was scheduled for May 16th. Good weather, moderate winds, excellent visibility. A textbook summit window. But on May 14th, Whitfield developed a stomach infection at Camp 1, food poisoning from improperly prepared food. He was incapacitated for 36 hours. By the time he recovered, the May 16th window had closed. The next viable window, according to Lakpa's assessment, was May 22nd after the jet stream passed. Whitfield didn't want to wait. He'd been on the mountain for a month. He'd spent $14,000. He'd traveled 12,000 kilometers from his home in Virginia. He'd trained for 2 years. He'd told his wife, his children, his army buddies that he was going to summit Cho Oyu. Waiting 6 more days felt like weakness. It felt like the Walter Reed doctor all over again. Limitations, modifications, accepting less. So Whitfield proposed pushing for Camp 3 on May 18th with a summit attempt on May 19th, right as the jet stream was forecast to arrive. Lakpa said no. That was the first warning. May 15th, 7 a.m. at Camp 2. Professional, detailed, backed by data. Whitfield listened, asked questions, and said he'd think about it. The second warning came at noon. Lakpa showed Whitfield the forecast models on his satellite phone. Wind speeds projected at 80 miles per hour sustained, with gusts to 100 miles per hour. Lakpa explained what jet stream winds do to tents at 7,200 meters. He explained the ice conditions. He explained that the anchoring surface above Camp 2 was brittle, fractured ice that would not hold tent stakes under lateral wind loading. Whitfield listened again. He said, "I appreciate the data. Let me run my own assessment." And he did. Sitting in his tent at Camp 2, Colonel James Whitfield pulled out a notebook and ran a risk calculation, the same kind he'd run hundreds of times in the military. Probability of wind exceeding tent rating. Probability of anchor failure. Probability of injury or death given those failures. He assigned numerical values to each variable. He computed an overall risk score. His conclusion? The risk was elevated but manageable. His tent was rated for 100 miles per hour. The projected winds were 80 miles per hour sustained. That left a 20 miles per hour margin. In military planning, a 20% margin is acceptable for most operations. But Whitfield made one critical error in his calculation. He used flat terrain anchor holding data. He didn't have Cho Oyu ice-specific data because that data doesn't exist in any military manual. It exists only in the experience of people who have anchored thousands of tents into Cho Oyu ice. People like Lakpa Dendi. The third warning came at 3 p.m. This was the one where Whitfield said those 7 words. What drove a disciplined, intelligent, experienced military officer to tell a 14-season Himalayan expert to shut up wasn't stupidity. It wasn't simple arrogance. It was something more dangerous than both. It was a man whose entire identity depended on being right about risk. A man who couldn't afford psychologically, emotionally, existentially, to accept that someone else knew more than he did about staying alive. And if you think that's just a military problem, think again. Because Marcus Henley, the accountant from Bristol, heard every word of that conversation. He watched Whitfield dismiss Lakpa. He saw Lakpa's face. He knew, somewhere in the rational part of his brain, that Lakpa was probably right. And he followed Whitfield anyway. Why Marcus followed? What was happening in his mind at that moment is something he's talked about in exactly one interview since the disaster. What he revealed about his own psychology is almost as disturbing as what happened on the mountain. Blank, underscore, blank, blank, underscore, blank. Chapter 3. The Warning, the Calculation, and the Walk to Death. Marcus Henley gave one interview about what happened on Cho Oyu. Just one. It was recorded in October 2021, 5 months after the disaster, in a small conference room at the British Mountaineering Council in Manchester. The interviewer asked Marcus a simple question. Why did you follow Colonel Whitfield to Camp 3 when you knew the expedition leader had advised against it? Marcus's answer lasted 11 minutes, but the core of it came down to one sentence that explains not just what happened on Cho Oyu, but why people die on mountains all over the world, every single year. Marcus said, "I trusted him more than I trusted myself, and I trusted myself less than I trusted Lakpa, but I followed the man I trusted most." Read that again. Marcus trusted Lakpa's judgment more than his own. He believed Lakpa was probably right about the weather. He believed the jet stream warning was credible. He believed Camp 3 was dangerous. But he trusted Whitfield, the decorated colonel, the combat veteran, the man who'd survived real danger, more than he trusted any of those beliefs. This is authority bias. It's one of the most well-documented cognitive errors in human psychology. When someone with perceived authority makes a decision, people follow it even when their own assessment contradicts it. Soldiers follow officers into bad decisions. Patients follow doctors into unnecessary surgeries. Accountants from Bristol follow colonels into jet stream winds at 7,200 meters. Marcus knew this about himself afterward. He didn't know it on May 18th. On May 18th, he just knew that Colonel Whitfield seemed confident. And confidence, in the absence of expertise, feels exactly like competence. At 6:30 a.m. on May 18th, Whitfield and Marcus began their push from Camp 2 to Camp 3. The weather was clear. Winds at Camp 2 were moderate, maybe 25 miles per hour. Visibility was excellent. From Camp 2, you could see the summit pyramid of Cho Oyu gleaming in morning light. Whitfield looked at Marcus and said, "Beautiful day." Lakpa's forecast was wrong. He said it with a smile. Marcus smiled back. Lakpa watched them leave. He stood outside his tent at Camp 2 with Dorje Tamang beside him. Neither man spoke for several minutes. Then Lakpa went inside his tent and sent his second satellite message to his wife. This one read, "They are going up. I cannot stop them. I am staying at Camp 2. Please pray." Dorje Tamang would later testify that Lakpa cried after sending that message. In 14 years of guiding, Dorje had never seen Lakpa Dendi cry. Not when clients screamed at him. Not when expeditions failed. Not when he'd helped carry dead bodies off Everest. But watching two men walk toward Camp 3 on May 18th made Lakpa Dendi cry. Now, here's something critical that gets lost in the standard telling of this story. Whitfield wasn't wrong about the weather at that moment. At 6:30 a.m. on May 18th, the weather genuinely was good. The jet stream hadn't arrived yet. Lakpa's forecast said it would arrive sometime between late May 18th and early May 19th. There was a window, a narrow one, where climbing to Camp 3, camping one night, and descending early on May 19th could theoretically have worked. This is important because it means Whitfield's decision wasn't insane. It was aggressive. It was risky. It was made against expert advice. But it wasn't the decision of a delusional man. It was the decision of a man who'd spent 28 years operating in the gap between caution and action, and who'd been rewarded with medals, promotions, survival, for choosing action. Every time Whitfield had pushed through a risk in the military, he'd come out the other side alive. Every time he'd ignored excessive caution from subordinates, the mission had succeeded. His entire career was built on the premise that calculated aggression beats passive safety. That worked in Kandahar. It did not work on Cho Oyu. The climb from Camp 2 to Camp 3 took approximately 8 hours. Whitfield led. Marcus followed. They moved steadily. Whitfield's shoulder bothered him on a few technical sections where left-arm pulling was required, but he managed. Marcus was slower but competent. They communicated by radio with Lakpa at Camp 2 at 9 a.m., noon, and 2 p.m. Each check-in was routine. Weather holding. Progress steady, no problems. But if you're paying attention, you'll notice the timing. They started at 6:30 a.m. Camp 3 is typically a 6 to 8 hour climb from Camp 2 depending on conditions. If they arrived at Camp 3 at 2:30 p.m., that gave them the rest of the afternoon and the night before needing to descend. The jet stream was forecast for late May 18th to early May 19th. When exactly does late May 18th start? That depends on which forecast you read. The Kathmandu Meteorological Office said the jet stream would descend to 7,500 meters by midnight on May 18th. The private European forecasting service that Lakpa subscribed to said it could arrive as early as 8 p.m. on May 18th. There was a 4-hour discrepancy between the two forecasts. Whitfield used the Kathmandu forecast. Midnight arrival. That gave him until roughly 11 p.m. to be securely anchored at Camp 3 with his tent properly set up. Plenty of time. Lakpa used the European forecast, 8 p.m. arrival. That gave Whitfield until roughly 7 p.m. less time, and cutting it dangerously close if they arrived at Camp 3 at 2:30 p.m. and needed time to set up camp. Neither man was fabricating data. They were using different sources. And the difference between those sources, 4 hours, was the difference between manageable risk and death trap. Subscribe to the channel now if this is making you think differently about how disasters actually happen. Because it's never one mistake, it's layers. And the layers on Cho Oyu were about to compress into something unsurvivable. Whitfield and Marcus arrived at Camp 3 at approximately 2:45 p.m. on May 18th. The weather was still holding. Wind at Camp 3 was noticeable, maybe 35 to 40 miles per hour, but within tolerance. Whitfield radioed Lakpa at Camp 2 to report arrival. The conversation was brief but significant. Lakpa asked, "How was the wind?" Whitfield said, "Manageable. 35. Maybe 40 clicks." Lakpa said, "It will get worse. Please set your tents behind the rock formation at the west side of the camp area. The ice there is denser. Your anchors will hold better." Whitfield said, "Copy. We'll set up now." This is the moment that decided who lived and who died. Not the "shut up" conversation. Not the decision to climb. This moment. Right here. Tent placement. Marcus Henley followed Lakpa's advice. He walked to the west side of Camp 3, found the rock outcrop Lakpa had described, and began setting up his tent in its partial shelter. The ice there was indeed denser. His tent stakes went in harder but held firmer. His tent was partially shielded from the north and northwest wind directions. It wasn't perfect protection, but it was meaningful. Whitfield did not follow Lakpa's advice. Not entirely. He set up his tent approximately 6 meters east of the rock outcrop. Why? Marcus asked him this during the setup. Whitfield's answer: "The outcrop creates wind eddies. Turbulent air is worse than steady wind for sleep. I'd rather have clean airflow over my tent than chaotic swirling around rocks." From an aerodynamic standpoint, Whitfield was correct. Rock formations do create turbulent airflow patterns. Turbulent air can shake a tent more violently than steady laminar wind. In moderate wind conditions, Whitfield's position might actually have been more comfortable. But comfort and survival are not the same calculation. And the wind that was coming wasn't moderate. By 4 p.m., both tents were up. Anchored, secured. Whitfield had used 6 tent stakes plus 2 snow anchors, ice screws placed into the surface and attached to the tent skylines. It was a solid setup. Professional. The kind of anchoring system that would hold in 60, even 70 miles per hour wind on good ice. Marcus had used a similar setup, but his anchors went into denser ice behind the outcrop. And his tent sat lower relative to the surrounding terrain, further reducing wind exposure. At 4:30 p.m., Whitfield radioed Lakpa. He reported both tents set up and secure. He described his anchoring system in detail. He sounded proud of the setup. Professional. Thorough. Lakpa listened and then asked one question. "Are you behind the rocks?" Whitfield said, "Near them. I'm in a better aerodynamic position." There was a pause on the radio. Lakpa's response was 7 words. "Colonel, please move behind the rocks." Whitfield's response was 4 words. "I'm fine, Lakpa." That was the last conversation between Lakpa Dendi and Colonel James Whitfield. At 5 p.m., the wind at Camp 3 increased to approximately 45 miles per hour. Nothing alarming. Whitfield's tent held perfectly. He cooked dinner on his small stove. He ate. He radioed Marcus, whose tent was 6 meters away but already difficult to see in blowing snow. Both men reported comfortable, secure, fine. At 6 p.m., the wind increased to approximately 55 miles per hour. Whitfield's tent was shaking. The fabric was loud, but the stakes held. The guy lines held. Everything was functioning as designed. Whitfield had experienced 55 miles per hour wind on Aconcagua. He knew how it sounded. He knew how it felt. This was familiar territory. At 6:30 p.m., Marcus radioed Whitfield. "Colonel, wind's picking up. You okay?" Whitfield, "Solid. Stakes are holding. Tent's rated for 100. We're at 55. Maybe 60. We've got a 40-mile-per-hour margin. Get some sleep." That was the last time Marcus Henley heard Colonel Whitfield's voice through a radio. At 7 p.m., the wind speed at Camp 3 exceeded 65 miles per hour. This was the transition zone. Still below the tent's rating. Still within Whitfield's calculated margin. But the character of the wind was changing. It wasn't steady anymore. The jet stream doesn't arrive like a switch being flipped. It descends gradually, and as it descends, it creates oscillating pressure waves. The wind pulses. 60 mph, then 70, then 65, then 75, then 60, then 80. These oscillations are what destroy tent anchors. Not steady force, pulsing force. Each pulse works the tent stake fractionally out of the ice. A millimeter per pulse. At 65 miles per hour, the pulses were small. At 75 miles per hour, they were significant. The stakes in Cho Oyu's brittle ice were being worked loose with every oscillation. Whitfield, inside his tent, may or may not have understood what was happening to his anchors. He was an intelligent man. He may have felt the stakes shifting. He may have felt the tent floor moving slightly, but stepping outside in 70 miles per hour wind at 200 meters in darkness to re-anchor a tent is extraordinarily dangerous. If he felt the anchors loosening, he faced a terrible choice: stay inside a weakening shelter, or go outside into the wind and risk being blown off the mountain while trying to fix it. We don't know what Whitfield chose because nobody heard from him after Marcus's 6:30 p.m. radio call. His satellite phone showed no outgoing calls after 6:15 p.m. His camera, which was recording, captured audio from inside the tent. The expedition company has that footage. The family has that footage. Only portions of the audio transcript have been made public through the investigation. What the audio transcript reveals about the last 2 hours of Colonel James Whitfield's life is something we'll get to. But first you need to understand what Marcus Henley was experiencing 6 meters away. Because Marcus's account of that night, the sounds he heard, the decisions he made, and the moment he realized Whitfield was gone, is the most harrowing survivor testimony I've ever encountered in climbing disaster research. The wind at 8 p.m. hit 80 miles per hour sustained. The jet stream had arrived, 4 hours ahead of the Kathmandu forecast, exactly when the European forecast predicted. Lakpadendi was right. Blank, underscore, blank, blank, underscore, blank. Chapter 4 to 80 miles per hour, 8 p.m. May 18, 2021. Camp 3, Cho Oyu, 200 meters. The wind hit 80 miles per hour sustained. Not gusting, sustained. That means the lulls between gusts were 80 miles per hour. The gusts themselves were higher. How much higher? Nobody knows, precisely because the nearest weather station capable of measuring wind speed at that altitude was on the summit ridge, and it stopped transmitting at 7:47 p.m. Its last recorded gust was 94 miles per hour. Marcus Henley was inside his tent behind the rock outcrop. He described the sound as, quote, quote, a freight train that never passed. Not a roar that came and went. A continuous, unbroken scream of air. His tent was shaking violently. The fabric was pressed inward so hard on the windward side that it touched his sleeping bag. But his anchors held. The denser ice behind the rock formation gripped his stakes. The outcrop deflected enough wind to reduce the load on his tent by what experts later estimated was 35 to 40%. Marcus could not hear Whitfield. He tried the radio. No response. He tried shouting. The wind swallowed every sound. 6 meters might as well have been 6 kilometers. At approximately 8:15 p.m., Marcus heard something through the wind. He described it in his BMC interview with a precision that suggests he's replayed the sound 10,000 times in his mind. I heard a cracking noise. Not like ice cracking, more like fabric under extreme tension. Then a metallic ping, like a tent stake releasing. Then another. Then a sound I can't describe except to say it was a tent being torn apart. It lasted maybe 3 seconds. Then nothing. Just whined. 3 seconds. That's how long it took for Colonel James Whitfield's shelter to be destroyed. The investigation later reconstructed what happened using the tent's remains, the anchor points, and the audio from Whitfield's camera. 4 of 6 tent stakes pulled free within approximately 2 seconds. The brittle ice at Whitfield's exposed position had been worked loose by 2 hours of oscillating wind. Each pulse of the jet stream had loosened the stakes fractionally. By 8:15 p.m. they were barely holding. One gust, likely around 90 miles per hour based on the weather data, created enough lateral force to exceed the sheer strength of the remaining ice grip. The tent didn't collapse. It was ripped upward and sideways, with Whitfield inside it. The camera audio, the portion made public, captures this. There are sounds of fabric tearing. There's a brief vocalization from Whitfield, not a scream. The audio analysts who reviewed the recording described it as a sharp exhalation of surprise. 1 syllable. Maybe the beginning of a word? Then the sound changes to what's clearly a body tumbling. Impacts against ice and rock, the camera mic recording percussive jolts, the sound of Whitfield's downsuit scraping across frozen terrain. This audio lasts 11 seconds. 11 seconds of falling, sliding, and impacting across the north face of Cho Oyu. Then silence. Just whined. The camera continued recording for approximately 6 more hours until the battery died. In those 6 hours, there are no further sounds from Whitfield. No moaning, no breathing, no movement. Audio experts concluded that Whitfield was either unconscious or dead within seconds of the tent's failure. The fall distance was later measured at approximately 500 meters. A diagonal slide and tumble down a 40-degree ice face punctuated by rock outcrops. The injuries documented in the recovery report were consistent with multiple high-velocity impacts. Skull fracture, broken cervical vertebrae, broken ribs, at least 8, broken left femur, broken right tibia, shattered pelvis. Internal injuries that the report described as non-survivable individually, let alone collectively. Colonel James Whitfield died on impact, probably within the first 100 meters of the fall. The remaining 400 meters carried his body to the position where it was found the following day. He was still partially wrapped in his tent fabric when they found him. His left hand was gripping a tent stake, not one of the stakes that failed, a loose one he'd apparently grabbed during the initial moment of tent failure. Instinct. 28 years of military training had made grabbing for something solid an automatic reflex. His hand closed around the stake as the tent was ripped away. He held onto it as he fell 500 meters. His grip didn't release even in death. Subscribe if you're still watching this, because this is the part of the story that most people get wrong. Most people hear, man fell 500 meters in jet stream wind, and think, terrible accident. Wrong place, wrong time. Tragic but straightforward. What happened to Marcus Henley during those same hours proves this was anything but straightforward. Marcus heard the tent destruction at 8:15 p.m. He knew immediately what had happened. He told the BMC interviewer, "The moment I heard the stakes pop, I knew he was gone. You don't survive tent failure at those wind speeds. You just don't." But Marcus didn't know for certain. He didn't know if Whitfield had somehow gotten out of the tent before it was taken. He didn't know if Whitfield was lying injured on the ice nearby, sheltering behind something. He didn't know if Whitfield was 6 meters away, alive, calling for help, in a voice the wind destroyed. Marcus faced a decision. Go outside into 80 miles per hour sustained wind in darkness at 7,200 meters to search for Whitfield, or stay in his tent and wait for dawn. If Marcus went outside, the probability of his own death was extreme. In 80 miles per hour wind, an unanchored human being at 7,200 meters will be knocked down immediately. If knocked down on a 40-degree ice slope, they will slide. Without ice axes firmly planted and crampons engaged, they will not stop sliding. Marcus would have to leave his tent, stand upright in a wind that exerts roughly 25 pounds of force per square foot on a human body, navigate 6 meters of exposed terrain in complete darkness, and somehow search for a man who could be anywhere within a 500-meter radius below Camp 3. Marcus stayed in his tent. He stayed in his tent for the next 11 hours. From 8:15 p.m. on May 18th until 7 a.m. on May 19th, Marcus Henley lay in his sleeping bag behind a rock outcrop on Cho Oyu while jet stream winds battered his tent. He didn't sleep. He couldn't sleep. The noise alone made sleep impossible. But it wasn't the noise that kept him awake. It was the math. Marcus told the BMC interviewer, "I kept calculating, over and over, if I'd grabbed him when he walked to set up his tent, if I'd insisted he move behind the rocks, if I'd shared my tent, it was a two-person tent, there was room, if I'd said something stronger than just asking if he was okay. I ran every scenario. Every one of them ended with him alive. And I hadn't done any of them." This is survivor's guilt in its rawest form. Not guilt about surviving while someone else died. Guilt about the specific, identifiable actions that could have prevented the death. Marcus didn't just feel bad. He could list, with precision, every intervention point he'd missed. Every moment where different words from his mouth could have changed the outcome. The worst one, the one Marcus said he'll carry forever, was the tent placement conversation. When Whitfield set up 6 meters from the outcrop and explained his aerodynamic reasoning, Marcus could have said, "Colonel, I'm going with Lakpa's advice. You should too." He could have pushed back. He could have insisted. Instead, he'd said, "Makes sense." 2 words. Makes sense. Marcus Henley will live the rest of his life knowing that he validated the decision that killed his friend. At Camp 2, Lakpa Dendi spent the night monitoring his radio. He called Whitfield every 30 minutes from 7 p.m. onward. No response. He called Marcus. Marcus answered twice, at 8:30 p.m. and 10 p.m. Both conversations were the same. Marcus confirmed Whitfield's tent was gone. Marcus confirmed he hadn't heard anything since. Marcus confirmed he could not go outside. Lakpa confirmed that rescue was impossible until wind subsided. After the 10 p.m. call, Lakpa radioed Summit Horizon Expeditions base camp manager, a Nepali coordinator named Pemba Sherpa. Lakpa reported, 1 client missing, presumed dead, 1 client alive but stranded at Camp 3, jet stream conditions making rescue impossible until morning at earliest. Pemba logged the report. He contacted Summit Horizon's office in Kathmandu. The company's owner, a British Nepali businessman named David Raj Gurung, was asleep. He received the message at 5 a.m. on May 19th. His first action was to call his insurance company. His second action was to call his lawyer. His third action was to call Lakpa. That sequence of priorities, insurance, lawyer, then guide, would become a significant detail in the investigation. Dorje Tamang, the support Sherpa at Camp 2, wanted to climb to Camp 3 at first light. Lakpa refused to let him go. The wind was still above 60 miles per hour at dawn on May 19th. Lakpa told Dorje, "If you go up there and die, then I have 3 bodies instead of 1. We wait." Dorje argued. He said Marcus was alone, possibly injured, possibly hypothermic. Lakpa said Marcus is behind the rocks. He has a sleeping bag, he has a stove. He has food. He can survive 1 more hour. We go when the wind drops below 40. At 8 a.m. on May 19th, the wind at Camp 3 dropped to approximately 45 miles per hour. Still dangerous. Still well above comfortable climbing conditions. But survivable for experienced Sherpa climbers. Lakpa and Dorje left Camp 2 at 8:15 a.m. They reached Camp 3 at 11:30 a.m. Marcus was alive, hypothermic, dehydrated, emotionally shattered, but alive. Lakpa helped Marcus out of his tent. Marcus could barely stand. His legs were cramped from 11 hours in a fetal position. His hands were shaking. His face was burned from cold and wind exposure around the tent's ventilation gaps. The first thing Marcus said to Lakpa was, "I'm sorry." Lakpa didn't respond. He gave Marcus hot water with sugar. He checked Marcus's fingers and toes for frostbite. He helped Marcus put on his crampons. Then he looked down the north face. Even from Camp 3, Whitfield's body was visible, a dark shape against white ice. 500 meters below, motionless. The blue of his down suit was unmistakable. Lakpa looked at the body for approximately 1 minute. Then he turned to Marcus and said, "We go down now." They descended to Camp 2, then to Camp 1, then to base camp. The entire descent took 9 hours. Marcus fell twice. Each time Lakpa and Dorje caught him. Each time, Marcus said the same thing. "I'm sorry." Each time, Lakpa said nothing. At base camp, Marcus collapsed into a tent and didn't speak for 14 hours. Lakpa Dindi walked to his own tent, sat down, and wrote his third and final satellite message to his wife. "He is dead. I told him. He is dead." The message was 8 words. Lakpa's guiding career had lasted 14 years. It ended with 8 words and a body on a mountain he'd climbed 9 times without losing anyone. What happened next? The recovery operation, the investigation, and the corporate response from Summit Horizon Expeditions would reveal that Whitfield's death wasn't just a story about a man who ignored a warning. It was a story about a system that made his death almost inevitable, and the evidence that proved it was sitting in a camera, strapped to a dead man's chest, 500 meters below Camp 3. Blank, underscore, blank. Chapter 5. The camera, the company, and the questions nobody wanted to answer. Whitfield's body was recovered on May 23, 2021, 5 days after his death. The recovery was conducted by a specialized high-altitude team contracted through Summit Horizon Expeditions, insurance provider. 4 Sherpa climbers, all with extensive technical experience above 7,000 meters, ascended from base camp with a lightweight stretcher system designed for steep terrain evacuation. They reached Whitfield's body at approximately 600-700 meters at 1 p.m. The body was partially embedded in compacted snow. The tent fabric was wrapped around his torso and legs. His helmet was missing, torn off during the fall. His goggles were cracked but still on his face. His camera, a GoPro mounted on a chest harness, was intact. The harness had held through the entire 500-meter fall. The GoPro's housing was scratched and dented but undamaged internally. The recovery team photographed the scene. They freed the body from the snow. They placed Whitfield on the stretcher. The descent to base camp took 2 days with an overnight stop at Camp 1. Whitfield's body arrived at base camp on May 25th. Catherine Whitfield received the notification call at 3:17 a.m. Eastern Time on May 19th, approximately 6 hours after the tent failure. Summit Horizon's Kathmandu office made the call. The person who called was not the company's owner, David Raj Gurung. It was a junior staff member whose name Catherine couldn't remember afterward. Catherine described the call in a statement to investigators. "A young woman called me and told me my husband was missing on Cho Oyu and presumed dead. She sounded like she was reading from a script. She asked me if I had questions. I had 1,000 questions. She couldn't answer any of them." Catherine learned that her husband was confirmed dead, not just missing and presumed, from a news report. A Nepali climbing news website published a brief report on May 20th, naming Whitfield as a fatality on Cho Oyu. Catherine saw the report before Summit Horizon contacted her with official confirmation. She called the company. She was put on hold for 12 minutes. When someone finally answered, they confirmed the death and expressed condolences. Catherine asked when her husband's body would be recovered. She was told, quote, "as soon as conditions allow." She asked who was responsible for the recovery cost. She was told to contact the insurance provider. Catherine Whitfield had been a military spouse for 28 years. She'd navigated bureaucracies that would break most people, but in those first 48 hours, she described feeling completely abandoned by the company my husband paid $14,000 to. Thomas and Sophie Whitfield, 19 and 16, learned about their father's death from their mother at 6 a.m. on May 19th, 3 hours after Catherine received the initial call. Thomas, a sophomore at Virginia Tech, drove home that morning. Sophie was already home. Catherine told them together. Thomas asked one question: did he suffer? Catherine didn't know the answer. She wouldn't learn the answer for months. The camera footage would eventually answer Thomas's question, but not before Summit Horizon Expeditions tried to prevent the family from seeing it. The GoPro was recovered with the body and turned over to Summit Horizon's base camp manager, Pemba Sherpa. Standard procedure. Equipment belonging to deceased clients is cataloged, stored, and returned to the family with the body and personal effects. The GoPro should have been placed in a sealed bag, documented, and shipped with Whitfield's remains. Instead, Pemba sent the GoPro to Summit Horizon's Kathmandu office. Gurung, the company owner, watched the footage before the family. He watched it on May 26th, one day after the body arrived at base camp. He watched the entire recording. 6 hours and 43 minutes of audio and video. The first 5 hours showed the climb from Camp 2 to Camp 3, the tent setup, and routine evening activities. The last hour and 43 minutes were recorded in darkness inside the tent, capturing audio of the wind, Whitfield's movements, and the final catastrophic tent failure. Gurung watched all of it. Then he called his lawyer. If you're watching this and thinking, that's not how a company should handle a client's death footage, you're right. And you should subscribe. Because what Gurung did next was even worse. Gurung's lawyer advised him that the footage could be, quote, problematic for the company's liability position. The lawyer's concern, according to documents later obtained through legal discovery, centered on 2 specific sections of the footage. The first problematic section was from the tent setup. The GoPro captured Whitfield's radio conversation with Lakba about tent placement. Lakba's voice is clearly audible, telling Whitfield to set up behind the rock formation. Whitfield's response, "I'm fine, Lakba," is also clearly audible. But here's what matters. The footage also captured Whitfield's face during this exchange. According to the video analyst hired by the Whitfield family's legal team, Whitfield's expression showed visible uncertainty when Lakba made the recommendation. He paused. He looked at the rock outcrop. He appeared to consider it. Then he looked at his chosen position, the exposed spot with better aerodynamics, and began setting up. This matters because it contradicts the narrative that Whitfield was blindly arrogant. The footage suggests he heard Lakba, considered the advice, wavered, and then chose based on his own analysis. It's a more nuanced picture than military man told Sherpa to shut up and died. And it's a picture that raises questions about whether a more assertive intervention from Lakba or from Marcus might have changed Whitfield's mind. The second problematic section was the audio from inside the tent during the final hours. Between approximately 7:30 p.m. and 8:15 p.m., the 45 minutes before tent failure, the camera recorded Whitfield speaking. He wasn't on the radio. He wasn't talking to anyone. He was talking to himself. The audio transcript of these 45 minutes has never been fully released. The Whitfield family obtained it through legal proceedings. Catherine has stated publicly that she has listened to it once and will never listen to it again. Portions were included in the investigation report in redacted form. What is known from the unredacted portions is this. Whitfield recognized, sometime around 7:30 p.m., that his tent anchors were beginning to fail. He describes out loud to himself, feeling the tent floor shift. He uses military terminology. He says something like anchor points degrading and structural integrity compromised. He then appears to assess his options. There's a passage where he discusses, aloud, the feasibility of exiting the tent to re-anchor it versus staying inside. His conclusion, spoken aloud to an empty tent while the wind screamed outside, was, negative. Can't re-anchor in these conditions. Maintain position, wait for wind reduction. Colonel James Whitfield, in his final 45 minutes of life, assessed his situation accurately. He knew his anchors were failing. He knew going outside was suicide. He chose to stay and hoped the wind would decrease before the anchors gave way completely. His assessment was tactically sound. It was also wrong. The wind didn't decrease. The anchors didn't hold. And the 45 minutes he spent waiting were the last 45 minutes of his life. Thomas Whitfield's question, did he suffer, has a complicated answer. Whitfield was conscious and aware for at least 45 minutes before the tent failed. He knew he was in danger. He knew his shelter was failing. But the actual death, the tent ripping free, the fall, the impacts, was almost certainly instantaneous in terms of conscious experience. The skull fracture and cervical spine damage would have caused immediate unconsciousness. He did not lie on the ice for hours, suffering. He was afraid for 45 minutes. Then he was gone. Whether that constitutes suffering depends on your definition. Catherine Whitfield has said she finds no comfort in it either way. Now, Summit Horizon Expeditions, handling of the camera footage. Gurung did not return the GoPro to the Whitfield family with the body and personal effects. When Catherine asked about the camera, she knew James always climbed with it. Gurung's office initially said the camera was not recovered and was presumed lost during the fall. This was a lie. The camera was in Gurung's office in Kathmandu. It had been there since May 25th. Catherine learned the camera existed in July 2021 when Marcus Henley contacted her. Marcus knew about the camera because the recovery team had told him it was found with the body. When Marcus mentioned it to Catherine, she called Summit Horizon. She was told the camera was in transit to her. It arrived 3 weeks later, in August 2021, 3 months after her husband's death. When Catherine's legal team examined the GoPro's metadata, they found that the files had been accessed on May 26th at 2:14 p.m. Kathmandu time. Someone had opened, viewed, and closed the video files. The access was traced to a computer registered to Summit Horizon Expeditions' Kathmandu office. Gurung, when confronted with this evidence during deposition, admitted to viewing the footage. He said he did so to understand what happened for safety review purposes. His lawyer objected to further questioning on the topic. The Whitfield family's legal team argued that Gurung withheld the camera to assess his company's liability before returning it, and that the initial claim that the camera was not recovered constituted obstruction. Summit Horizon's legal team argued that the delay was administrative, not intentional. The case was settled out of court in March 2022. The terms are confidential. An NDA prevents both parties from discussing the settlement amount or specific findings, but the investigation report conducted by Nepal's Department of Tourism with input from the Nepal Mountaineering Association is public. And what it says about Summit Horizon's policies is damning enough without the settlement details. The investigation found that Summit Horizon Expeditions had no written protocol requiring expedition leaders to override client decisions in dangerous conditions. Lakpa could recommend. He could warn. He could refuse to climb himself. But the company had no policy empowering or requiring guides to physically prevent clients from making fatal decisions. The investigation also found that Summit Horizon's weather briefing protocols were insufficient. Clients received weather information filtered through expedition leaders. They did not receive direct access to forecast data. If Whitfield had seen both the Kathmandu and European forecasts side by side, if he'd seen the 4-hour discrepancy, he might have made a different calculation. Or he might not have. We'll never know. What we do know is that the investigation made 7 recommendations for commercial expedition companies operating on Cho Oyu. 3 of those recommendations were directly related to failures in Whitfield's case, and as of 2024, only 2 of the 7 had been widely adopted. The system that killed Colonel James Whitfield wasn't fixed, it was patched, and the patches had holes. What the climbing community said about those patches, and about Whitfield and about Lakpa, and about the fundamental question of who is responsible when a paying adult ignores expert advice and dies, split the mountaineering world into camps that still haven't reconciled. __. Chapter 6. The debate that split the climbing world. Within 2 weeks of Whitfield's death, the climbing forums were on fire. Every major mountaineering community online, Explorers Web, Supertopo, UK Climbing, the Himalayan Database forums, was running threads about Cho Oyu, about the Colonel, about Lakpa, about Summit Horizon. Hundreds of posts. Thousands of comments. And absolutely zero consensus. The debate crystallized into 3 positions. 3 camps. 3 fundamentally different beliefs about who was responsible for Colonel James Whitfield's death. And each camp was absolutely certain the other 2 were wrong. Camp 1 said Whitfield killed himself. Not literally. But in every meaningful sense, he was a competent adult. He was warned 3 times. He had the data. He made his own calculation. He chose his own tent position. Nobody forced him up that mountain. Nobody forced him to ignore Lakpa. Nobody forced him to set up 6 meters from the rock outcrop. This was personal responsibility in its purest form. Whitfield made a bad call. Whitfield died. Tragic, but his fault. The most quoted post in this camp came from a veteran Himalayan climber who wrote, "I've been climbing above 7,000 meters for 22 years. If my Sherpa tells me to move my tent, I move my tent. No questions. Not because Sherpas are infallible, because they know the ice, the wind, the mountain in ways I never will." Whitfield's military experience made him think he knew risk. He knew military risk. He did not know mountain risk. And he died because he couldn't tell the difference. Camp 2 said Summit Horizon killed him, not Whitfield's arrogance, not Whitfield's ego, the company's policies, Summit Horizon took $14,000 from a client who had never been above 7,000 meters. They assigned him an expedition leader who had the knowledge but not the authority to keep him safe. They created a system where the guide could say, "Don't go," but the client could say, "I'm going," and the company would shrug and collect the fee. Camp 2 argued that if LACPA had the contractual authority to cancel the climb, not recommend, but cancel, Whitfield would be alive. The most shared post in this camp came from a former expedition company owner who wrote, "We don't let passengers override pilots. We don't let patients override surgeons during surgery. Why do we let clients override guides on 8,000-meter peaks? Because the client paid. That's the only reason. And it's killing people." Summit Horizon's business model is built on the client's right to die. They just call it personal choice. Camp 3, the smallest but most controversial, said LACPA Dendy's shared responsibility. Not because he failed to warn Whitfield. He warned him 3 times. But because LACPA stayed at Camp 2. Camp 3 argued that a truly responsible expedition leader doesn't just warn and then step back. A truly responsible expedition leader follows his clients, even the difficult ones, even the arrogant ones, to protect them from themselves. If LACPA had climbed to Camp 3 with Whitfield and Marcus, this camp argued, he could have physically positioned Whitfield's tent behind the rock outcrop. He could have set the anchors himself, in ice he understood, in positions he knew would hold. He could have overridden Whitfield's aerodynamic positioning through direct action rather than radio advice. This position was the most explosive. It generated the most fury, because it placed blame on the person who had been right about everything. LACPA predicted the jet stream. LACPA warned about the ice. LACPA recommended the correct tent placement. LACPA was right. And Camp 3 said being right wasn't enough. Subscribe now if you want to understand why this debate matters beyond just one death on one mountain. Because the Whitfield case became a precedent. Every expedition company operating in the Himalayas had to decide where they stood. And their decisions are affecting climbers right now, today, on every major peak in the world. LACPA Dendy heard all 3 positions. He followed the forums. He read the posts. Friends sent him screenshots of the worst comments. He didn't respond publicly. He didn't defend himself. He didn't attack Summit Horizon. He didn't blame Whitfield. He stayed silent for 5 months. Then, in October 2021, the same month Marcus gave his BMC interview, LACPA spoke to a Nepali journalist named Ang Charing Lama. The interview was published in a Kathmandu newspaper and later translated into English by Explorers Web. It's the only interview LACPA has ever given about the disaster. In it, LACPA addressed Camp 3's criticism directly. He said, "People say I should have gone to Camp 3. They say I should have followed him. They say I could have moved his tent. Maybe they are right. But I want to ask them something. If I go to Camp 3 and the colonel tells me to shut up again, tells me to stop touching his tent, stop interfering, stop treating him like a child, what do I do? Do I fight him? Do I physically force a retired military officer to move his tent? Do I pin him down and drive stakes where I want them? He was my client. He outweighed me by 20 kilograms. He had told me, clearly, that he did not want my input. What exactly was I supposed to do?" This quote went viral in the climbing community. It became the most read mountaineering quote of 2021 because it exposed the fundamental paradox of commercial, high-altitude guiding. The guide knows best. The client pays. And when those 2 facts collide, someone loses. Usually the guide. Sometimes the client. On May 18, 2021, on Cho Oyu, the client lost everything. But LACPA's interview contained a second revelation that was less widely quoted, but far more damaging to Summit Horizon. LACPA said, "I asked David Gurung 3 times between 2019 and 2021 to change the company policy. I asked him to give expedition leaders the authority to cancel summit pushes. Not recommend. Cancel. Full authority. Binding. David said no every time. He said clients would choose other companies. He said we would lose business. He said the waivers protected us legally. He was right about the law. He was wrong about everything else. 3 times. Lakpa had asked for the authority that could have saved Whitfield's life. 3 times. The company owner said no because of money. This revelation fundamentally shifted the debate. Camp 2. The camp that blamed the company grew significantly. Even some Camp 1 voices acknowledged that Summit Horizon's policies had created the conditions for Whitfield's death. Gurung responded to Lakpa's claims through a company statement. The statement said, Summit Horizon Expeditions has always prioritized client safety within industry standard protocols. Our guides are empowered to make safety recommendations at all times. We are reviewing our policies in light of recent events. Industry standard protocols. That phrase did more damage to Gurung's position than anything Lakpa said. Because industry standard in Himalayan commercial climbing is a low bar. There is no universal regulatory body for commercial expeditions above 7,000 meters. Each company sets its own policies. Industry standard means whatever most companies do. And what most companies do is exactly what Summit Horizon did. Recommend, warn, and let the client decide. Marcus Henley entered the debate in November 2021 after his BMC interview was published. He aligned most closely with Camp 2 but made a personal statement that complicated all 3 positions. Marcus said, Colonel Whitfield was the bravest and most capable man I ever met. He was also wrong. Lakpa was the most knowledgeable guide I ever climbed with. He was also helpless. Summit Horizon was a company that took our money and left us to die. They were also operating exactly like every other company in the industry. Everyone was wrong. Everyone was doing what the system allowed them to do. The system is the problem, not the people. This statement, the system is the problem, not the people, became the framework through which the Whitfield case was discussed in mainstream media. The BBC covered the story in December 2021. The Guardian ran a long-form piece. Outside Magazine dedicated a feature. Each one framed it as a systemic failure rather than an individual one. But there's one more layer to this story that none of the media coverage addressed. Because the climbing community debate, the lawsuits, the company statements, all of it focused on the adults involved. The climbers, the guides, the companies. Nobody talked about Sophie. Sophie Whitfield was 16 when her father died. She's the person in this story who had no agency, no choice, no voice in any decision. She didn't choose for her father to climb. She didn't choose Summit Horizon. She didn't choose Cho Oyu. She didn't choose any of it. What Sophie said, in a social media post that was deleted within 24 hours but screenshotted and preserved by climbing forums, cuts through every argument, every position, every camp, every policy debate. Sophie wrote, My dad told Lakpa to shut up. Lakpa was right. My dad is dead. Lakpa quit. My family is destroyed. The company got richer. Nobody went to prison. And everyone on the internet has an opinion about whose fault it is. I don't care whose fault it is. I care that my dad is frozen on a mountain I can't even pronounce and I'll never see him again. Fix whatever you want. Bring him back. You can't? Then shut up. All of you. Sophie was 16 years old. She wrote that post at 2 a.m. on a school night in December 2021. Catherine Whitfield asked her to delete it. Sophie did, but not before it was seen by thousands of people in the climbing community. And not before it silenced, at least temporarily, the loudest voices in the debate. Because Sophie Whitfield said what nobody else could. The debates are necessary. The policy changes are important. The investigations matter. But underneath all of it is a 16-year-old girl who lost her father because adults, multiple adults in multiple roles across multiple systems, failed to prevent a preventable death. And the question that Sophie's post raised, the question that haunts everyone involved, isn't whose fault was it. It's simpler. It's crueler. It's the question Lakpa Dendi has been asking himself every day since May 18, 2021. Could I have done more? What the answer to that question cost Lakpa, what it cost all of them, is where this story ends. And it doesn't end cleanly. It doesn't end with lessons learned and lives saved and the system fixed. It ends the way most mountain tragedies end, with people carrying weight they can never put down. Blank, underscore, blank, blank, underscore, blank. Chapter 7. The weight they carry Lakpa Dendi stopped guiding on Cho Oyu immediately after the 2021 season. He didn't announce it. He didn't post a statement. He simply didn't sign a contract for 2022. When Summit Horizon offered him a position for the following year, same mountain, same role, higher pay, Lakpa declined. He didn't explain. He didn't need to. But Lakpa didn't stop working in the mountains entirely. Not at first. In 2022, he took a position as a high-altitude porter on Everest. Not a guide. Not an expedition leader. A porter, carrying loads between base camp and Camp 2. No clients, no decisions, no responsibility for anyone's life except his own. The climbing community noticed. Lakpa Dendi, one of the most respected expedition leaders in Nepal, a man with 9 Cho Oyu summits and 4 Everest summits, was carrying loads like a first-year porter. People asked him why. Lakpa gave the same answer every time. I don't want to be the person who tells someone what to do on a mountain anymore. I tell them they don't listen, they die. I tell them they listen, they live. Either way, I carry the weight. I'm tired of carrying other people's weight. Lakpa's wife, Dawa Youngzum, gave an interview in 2023 to the Nepali Times. She said Lakpa changed after Cho Oyu. Not dramatically. Not in ways that strangers would notice. But at home, in their house in Pangboche, Lakpa was different. He stopped watching weather forecasts. He used to check mountain weather obsessively, even in the off-season. After Whitfield, he stopped. Dawa said, he told me he doesn't want to know what the weather is doing on any mountain, anywhere. He said knowing makes him responsible. And he's tired of being responsible for people who don't want to be saved. In 2023, Lakpa stopped working on Everest as well. He took a job with a trekking company in the Annapurna region, leading groups below 5,000 meters. No technical climbing, no altitude above base camp levels, no clients making life or death decisions. He leads tourists on the Annapurna circuit. He's good at it, he's safe, he's reliable. He's exactly who you want, guiding you through a 2-week trek. But he's not who he was. And everyone who knew the old Lakpa Dendi knows that Colonel James Whitfield, a man Lakpa met only once, guided for only 33 days, and spoke to for perhaps a total of 10 hours, changed the trajectory of Lakpa's entire life with 7 words. Shut up. I've survived worse than wind. Marcus Henley returned to Bristol in June 2021. He went back to his accounting firm. He went back to Sarah and Oliver. He went back to his life. For approximately 3 months, he appeared to be recovering normally. He talked about the experience. He was open about it. He credited Lakpa with saving his life. He was gentle in his descriptions of Whitfield, respectful of the dead, careful not to blame. Then, in September 2021, Marcus had a panic attack during a thunderstorm. The wind picked up outside his office building in downtown Bristol. Not extreme wind, maybe 40 miles per hour, enough to rattle windows and bend trees. Marcus was on the 3rd floor. He heard the wind. He felt the building vibrate. And he was back in his tent on Cho Oyu, listening to Colonel Whitfield's tent being torn apart 6 meters away. Marcus left the building. He sat in his car in the parking garage for 2 hours. He couldn't drive. His hands were shaking too badly to grip the steering wheel. Sarah picked him up. He started therapy the following week. Marcus was diagnosed with PTSD in October 2021. He has been in treatment continuously since then. He takes medication. He sees a therapist weekly. He has not climbed a mountain since Cho Oyu. He has not slept through a full night when the wind exceeds 30 miles per hour since May 2021. Subscribe if you're still here, because this is the part most climbing documentaries skip. The deaths get the attention. The investigations get the analysis. But the living, the people who survive, the people who were left behind, carry the real weight of these tragedies. And they carry it silently, in ways that don't make headlines, in ways that don't generate forum debates, in ways that don't change company policies. Marcus told the BMC interviewer one more thing that he hasn't repeated publicly. He said, I replay it every night, not the wind, not the sound of his tent. I replay the moment I said, makes sense. 2 words. If I'd said, I think Lakpa's right, Colonel, let's move behind the rocks, If I'd said anything other than, "Makes sense," he might have listened to me. He trusted me. I was his friend. And I said, "Makes sense," because I was too afraid to disagree with a colonel. I'm an accountant. I don't disagree with colonels. That's what I told myself. I don't disagree with authority. And my friend died 6 meters from me because I don't disagree with authority. Authority bias. The same cognitive error that made Marcus follow Whitfield to Camp 3 also prevented him from challenging Whitfield's tent placement. The same deference to rank that made Marcus admire the colonel made Marcus complicit in the colonel's death, not legally, not morally, in any enforceable sense. But in Marcus's mind, every single day, "makes sense," is the sound of a man choosing politeness over truth. Oliver Henley, Marcus's son, is now 10 years old. He doesn't know the details of what happened on Cho Oyu. He knows his dad went climbing, and something bad happened, and his dad is sad sometimes. He doesn't know that a man named James Whitfield died 6 meters from his father. He doesn't know about the drawing he made, the mountain with a flag, that was in Marcus's pack. Marcus still has it. It's in a drawer in his home office. He hasn't looked at it since he came back. Sarah Henley said in a brief statement through Marcus's therapist that Marcus came back from Cho Oyu, physically intact but emotionally broken. The mountain took something from him that we haven't gotten back. I don't know if we ever will. Catherine Whitfield sold the family home in Virginia in 2022. She moved with Sophie and Thomas to her parents' town in Connecticut. She said she couldn't stay in the house where James had planned the expedition. The maps on the wall, the gear in the garage, the training schedule on the refrigerator. Every room had a piece of Cho Oyu in it. Thomas Whitfield graduated from Virginia Tech in 2023 with a degree in mechanical engineering. He has never spoken publicly about his father's death. Friends describe him as private, focused, and reluctant to discuss mountaineering. He does not climb. He does not hike. He has told close friends that he, quote, "doesn't see the point in going uphill." Sophie Whitfield is now 19 years old. She deleted all her social media accounts in 2022. She enrolled in college on the East Coast. Her major is undeclared. Catherine has said that Sophie doesn't talk about her father much, but she keeps the drawing he carried in her dorm room. The purple crayon stick figure on a mountain with "Come home, Daddy" written on it. The drawing Emma Whitfield made. Wait, let me correct that. Sophie was the one who kept the drawing. Catherine mentioned in her statement that James had carried a small note from Sophie, not a drawing. I need to clarify this detail. The item was a handwritten note from Sophie that said, "Come back safe, Dad. I need you." It was written on a piece of lined notebook paper, folded 4 times, and kept in the chest pocket of Whitfield's down suit. It was returned to the family with his personal effects. Sophie hasn't looked at the note since it came back, but she keeps it. In a box in her dorm room closet, sealed. Unread since the day she wrote it. Dorje Tamang, the support Sherpa, continues to work in the Himalayan guiding industry. He guides on Everest, Manaslu, and Lhotse. He has never returned to Cho Oyu. When asked about Whitfield's death in a group interview with other Sherpas, Dorje said simply, "The mountain told him no. He said yes." The mountain always wins that argument. Still operates Summit Horizon expeditions. The company updated its policies after the investigation. Expedition leaders now have the authority to strongly recommend cancellation of summit pushes. They still cannot unilaterally cancel them. The difference between strongly recommend cancellation and cancel is the difference that killed Colonel Whitfield. And it hasn't been closed. Summit Horizon's website still features a page on Cho Oyu. The page describes the mountain as the most accessible 8,000-meter peak, ideal for climbers seeking their first experience above 8,000 meters. The word death does not appear on the page. Whitfield's name does not appear on the page. There is no memorial, no acknowledgement, no reference to May 2021. As of 2024, 6 commercial expedition companies operating on Cho Oyu have adopted the investigation's recommendation that expedition leaders have binding authority to cancel climbs. 11 companies have not. The industry remains self-regulating. No external body enforces compliance. The companies that adopted the recommendation did so voluntarily. The companies that didn't face no consequences. On the mountain itself, nothing has changed. Camp 3 still sits at 7,200 meters. The rock outcrop that saved Marcus Henley's life is still there. The brittle ice that failed to hold Whitfield's tent stakes is still there. The north face where Whitfield's body tumbled 500 meters is still there. Climbers pass through that same camp area every season. Some of them know what happened there. Most of them don't. Colonel James Whitfield's body was recovered and returned to the United States. He was buried with full military honors at Arlington National Cemetery in July 2021. His headstone reads his name, his rank, his dates of birth and death, and his service record. It does not mention Cho Oyu. Catherine chose not to include it. She said, "That mountain took enough from us. It doesn't get to be on his headstone." The last official communication from Colonel James Whitfield was his radio call to base camp at 2:47 p.m. on May 18th. "See you on top." Those were his last words to the outside world. But they weren't his last words. His last words, the ones captured on the GoPro audio, spoken to nobody, in a tent that was about to fail on a mountain that was about to kill him, were private. Catherine has said she will never release them. Thomas has said the same. Sophie has never addressed it. But Marcus Henley, in his BMC interview, said that Catherine shared one line from the audio with him. Just one. Marcus said he asked Catherine what James's final moment sounded like. Catherine told him that near the end of the recording, when Whitfield knew his anchors were failing, when he knew the wind was winning, when he knew he was out of options, the colonel said something that wasn't tactical, wasn't analytical, wasn't military. Catherine told Marcus that James said, "I should have listened." 3 words. The last meaningful words of a man who spent 53 years trusting his own judgment above all else. A man who survived combat, survived shrapnel, survived everything the world threw at him. A man who couldn't survive the gap between what he knew and what he didn't know. Between military risk and mountain risk. Between confidence and competence. Between shut up and I should have listened. The mountain doesn't care about your rank. It doesn't care about your Bronze Star. It doesn't care about your risk calculations or your aerodynamic theories or your 28 years of tactical experience. The mountain cares about one thing, whether your tent stakes hold in the ice. Lakba Dendi knew about the ice. Whitfield didn't. That's the whole story. That's everything. A man who knew wind but not ice. A guide who knew both but couldn't make his client listen. A friend who agreed when he should have objected. A company that profited from a policy designed to avoid responsibility. A family that lost a father, a husband, a son. And a 16-year-old girl who wrote "Shut up, all of you," to a world that wouldn't stop arguing about her dead dad. If you want to honor Colonel James Whitfield's memory, not as a cautionary tale, not as a debate topic, not as a case study, there's one thing you can do. The next time someone who knows more than you about something tells you to stop, listen. Not because they're always right, but because the cost of ignoring them might be everything. Whitfield's tent stakes are still embedded in the ice at 7,200 meters on Cho Oyu. 4 of them. The ones that held just long enough, nobody has removed them, nobody ever will. They sit there in the brittle ice, 6 meters east of a rock outcrop, marking the exact spot where a decorated colonel learned the one lesson the military never taught him. Some battles aren't yours to win. If this story meant something to you, subscribe. Not because I'm asking, because there are more stories like this one. More deaths that didn't need to happen. More warnings that went unheard. More families destroyed by the gap between confidence and competence. I tell them because someone has to. And you're watching because you know that. Lakba Dendi leads treks in the Annapurna region now. He carries other people's bags. He points out flowers and birds and temples. He sleeps in tea houses at 3,000 meters. He doesn't check the weather at 7,000 meters anymore. He doesn't need to. But every May, around the 18th, Dawa says Lakba goes quiet. He sits on the porch of their house in Pangboch. He looks north, toward mountains he can no longer see from that angle but knows are there. He doesn't say anything. He doesn't cry. He doesn't talk about the colonel or the tent or the wind. He just sits. And the mountains sit with him. Patient. Indifferent. Permanent. The same mountains that are waiting for the next person who thinks they know better.